Okay, welcome back, economists. We are here to think about our next method of government intervention. So far, we have done videos on the idea of a maximum price, of a minimum price, and also an indirect tax. Okay, so when we talked about the idea of an indirect tax, we basically established that that is sort of like the government imposing a tax, the producers being responsible for collecting the tax, right? And then the consumers, when they are taxed, they pay the tax money to the producer, and that money goes indirectly through the producer to the government, right? So a good way to think about a subsidy, which was a topic of this video, is it's kind of the opposite of an indirect tax, right? A subsidy is a payment from the government to a producer. Sometimes subsidies can go to a consumer, but most of the time they'll go to a producer, right? And it's usually per unit, right? So for every 100 things, or 100 units, right? Producers will get a certain amount of money, okay? So this is obviously done to try to incentivize production. So for some things that are underproduced, or if the price is too high. All right, so it's a payment from the government to the producer, and it's usually per unit of output. Okay, so you need to be careful here. If you're thinking about writing about subsidies on an internal assessment, or you see it in a paper 1 or a paper 2 or a paper 3, just make a note, it's likely to be about a subsidy to the producer, but there are forms of subsidies out there that go to the consumer. But from the point of this video, we're going to talk about this from the standpoint of a subsidy to the producer. Okay? So you might be able to come to the conclusion then that subsidies impact supply. Okay? If it's a payment to the producer, right, that is going to mean increased revenue for that producer. Right? And when that happens, you need to ask yourself the question, well, what will that producer do with that extra revenue that is in addition to the revenue that they gain from selling their goods and services? Right? Businesses use revenue to purchase factors of production. We covered that in our video on the circular flow of income. Right? With increased revenue, what will likely happen is a business will scale up its operations. They will purchase more land, they'll purchase more capital, they'll hire some more workers, right? And they will add to their overall stock of factors of production. And those factors of production are, of course, what we know are our biggest determinant of supply. Okay, so subsidies increase supply. That's probably not a very difficult conclusion to come to, but let's just graph through that now. Okay, so a pretty healthy increase in supply there. The price will come down. Our price equilibrium will decrease, and as a result of that, our quantity equilibrium will increase. Now, this diagram is correct. It does show the impact of a subsidy. However, if you're going to get to the stage where you're thinking about how does a subsidy impact different stakeholders in the market, this diagram will not help you do that. You need to use a graph that's going to look somewhat similar to the tax incidence graph that we have covered in a previous video. Okay, so we're going to be adding some colors and some revenue boxes on this graph here, and there are a few important differences, but it'll look mostly similar to that. Okay, so instead of having a consumer burden and a producer burden, right, as a result of an indirect tax. Again, here we're thinking about a subsidy. Instead of the government collecting money, the government is giving money out, right? This is government spending. So, because of that, we now have consumer benefit as in how much of that subsidy actually ends up in the consumer's pocket, right? And then we also have the producer benefit, right? As in how much of that subsidy that's being given, how much is going to end up in the in increased revenue for the producer, okay? So same deal with our indirect tax graph. We're going to find our new quantity equilibrium, which is here at QE2. You're going to draw a line up to the initial supply curve, like that, okay? And then you're going to connect that point over to our price axis. You can call this point whatever you want, really. I think S for subsidy works, okay? So kind of like we said at the beginning of the video, subsidies are usually an amount per unit. So one example of a market that gets a lot of subsidies is renewable energy, specifically solar panels. So let's say for every solar panel that a business produces, they get a $2 subsidy. We can show that on this graph with the distance between S and our second price equilibrium. So this is the amount of the subsidy per unit. Okay, so in this case that would be $2. Okay? So I guess the first thing we're going to show here is deadweight loss. Now, this is the same label as our indirect tax graph. In that video, we talked about the power of tax being the power to destroy, as in taxes hurt productivity of businesses, and that is what deadweight loss is, really. It's lost resources. So in this way, we're still going to use deadweight loss as an idea, and we're still going to label it in the same place. So you might be thinking, subsidies are a good thing. Why is there still deadweight loss? And the reason for that is subsidies are not efficient, right? This business is increasing its supply because it's getting assistance from the government. So it's going to be producing beyond the point at which it could produce with the factors of production that it had, right? So let's say there's a $100 million spending program by the government to increase the production of solar panels. What will never happen is they're never going to get $100 million of increased productivity out of that company. They're not going to produce $100 million worth of new solar panels. Maybe they'll only produce $60 million of new solar panels, in which case there's 40% deadweight loss. $40 million of that subsidy goes to waste, right? Subsidies are inefficient, and anytime there is an inefficient allocation of government money, that is certainly deadweight loss, okay? So that's why we still have deadweight loss on this graph. The size of the deadweight loss, I will say, will depend on whether the demand and supply are elastic or inelastic, but we'll get to that sort of at the end of the video here, okay? So let's think about consumers. How are consumers benefited by a subsidy? Well, the biggest benefit to the consumer is they pay a lower price, all right? So the revenue box that we sort of have created here, as the price equilibrium goes down, that is the benefit to the consumer. They are paying lower prices for whatever the product is, and that means good things for their disposable income. They will now have more money to go spend on other things, okay? So this whole revenue box here, you're going to color that in all the way up to the point where we showed our deadweight loss, okay? So that is the amount of the subsidy that is going to the consumer in the form of lower prices, all right? So that is money literally flowing into the consumer's pocketbooks as a result of the subsidy, okay? So you might think about, well, why is it that producers are impacted? Why did they benefit from a subsidy? And we kind of answered this already. producers gain revenue from a subsidy, right? So with that in mind, the benefit that they get here is this part above the price equilibrium, where we connected the amount of the subsidy. So all of this is the producer benefit. Okay? So you'll notice that this is the opposite way of the indirect tax diagram, right? If you pause the video here and pull out your indirect tax diagram, when we diagrammed an indirect tax, we showed that supply decreases and the consumer burden is above the initial price equilibrium. Here, since a subsidy increases supply, right, we are showing that consumers benefit from lower prices, as in below the price equilibrium, okay? So if you don't get that part labeled correctly on a graph, you could lose marks on an assessment. So just make sure that you remember indirect taxes raise prices, and that's the burden on the consumer. Subsidies lower prices, and that is the benefit to the consumer. Okay? So another thing you can do, probably as soon as you hit the stop button on this video, is remember that the amount of the subsidy, as in who gets what, that is going to be dependent on, probably most importantly, the PED, right? So as soon as you stop this video, I want you to draw this diagram again, but I want you to show it with inelastic demand, right? If we put demand like this, that will have an impact on who gets what in terms of the subsidy. And same deal with elastic demand. If we put a demand curve in there that has a slope like that, that will have an impact on who gets what, right? If we adjust for PED, depending on what that PED is, that will have an impact on whether the consumer benefit is greater than the producer benefit, or whether the producer benefit is greater than the consumer benefit, okay? So again, it's an important thing to be considering what is the market that is being given a subsidy, right? And then try to think about, well, what is the PED of that market, okay? So I'm gonna leave you there. Go and draw those two graphs. A subsidy diagram that looks just like this, only with inelastic PED and elastic PED. Okay? Cool. So this is a graph you could very well need to use on a paper 1 or a paper 2 or an IA. A lot of good microeconomics commentaries can be written on subsidies. It's certainly a topic that is pertinent now because of the coronavirus pandemic. A lot of businesses are being granted subsidies by government because they were subject to some sort of lockdown where the government literally stopped them from having a regular flow of customers and hurt their revenue. Okay? So a really good topic for your IA, and a graph you'll need to be able to use to hit that objective on the guide when we're analyzing the impact of a subsidy on the different groups of stakeholders in a specific market. Okay? Thanks, guys.